Before I begin, I want to remind you guys about a story that broke not long ago regarding the leak of Capcom's roadmap of games in development or pending development. Of particular note was the fact that they had Street Fighter 6 planned, but then a complete edition of Street Fighter 6 planned for shortly thereafter. This isn't anything new. Capcom redoing iterative versions of their games for decades, from Street Fighter to Devil May Cry to Resident Evil 5. The pertinent takeaway from this leak, however, was an insight into the way Capcom thinks, their business model, and how ridiculously far ahead these decisions are made. The wizard behind the curtain was revealed in this instance. What it exposed was a business model that conceives of a published title as feature or content incomplete, to only then segment and siphon off the remainder of those planned features to a future paid DLC and then a complete version of the game, encouraging existing players to either double dip or to entice newcomers to pay full recommended retail price for the same game, which avoids the loss of revenue that may occur with purchases of the discounted vanilla game. This business model also gives a single player game with notoriously short tails a much longer one without the developer publisher having to dedicate a shit ton of resources, for example reusing assets from the parent game. I want you guys to remember this for later in the video. We'll come back to it. So what this video is about is the recent announcement of the paid YUFFIE story DLC for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, which will be exclusive to the PS5 iteration of the game. People are only picking up on the controversy surrounding the gating off of the DLC to PS4 owners, but I don't think that's even the most important thing. The important thing and question is why this paid story DLC even exists in the first place. The first thing you'll hear to challenge even the notion of the criticism is a bunch of false equivalences about how story DLC has been handled by the likes of Spider-Man, Control, Witcher, Kingdom Hearts, etc. I had plenty of stuff to say about those situations, but not all DLCs are created equal. Also to add, just because something is common practice doesn't make it any less shitty at every instance. For now, we're talking about the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. I love that just the first part of the FF7 Remake project is barely out the door and Square think they have the luxury of charging for story DLC. Just remember Square Enix's track record with this sort of thing, from FF15 to Kingdom Hearts and even to Dragon Quest XI. FF15 was downright obscene, characters disappearing randomly from the story and returning with giant revelatory bombshells which players had no context for, only to later get a series of paid DLCs filling that context back in. It's almost as though the game was released with these parts omitted to be charged for later. This was proven by the fact that even when the game was in its Versus 13 form, we saw gameplay of character switching and their unique suite of moves. This was not something they developed afterwards as a response to player demand, despite what Square Enix said. It was demonstrably omitted and far and away from what Nomura had in mind when he was spearheading the title. This was now a Final Fantasy that we would keep paying into like a game as service, and it's starting to feel an awful lot like we're repeating history here. So let's rewind a little bit and go back to just prior to FF7 Remake's release. Square Enix told us we couldn't get a playable Red 13 because slavish adherence to the original PS1 game meant introducing his gameplay mechanics would have been redundant. That's what they said, and yet they've now contrived a reason for an important character like YUFFIE to appear in Midgar of all places, introducing an entire suite of moves and deciding to charge you for the privilege. There's no good case scenario in this situation. If they had always planned it like this, like the Capcom example earlier, prior to the game's completion, it was shitty. If they contrived this to milk people after the game's completion, it's shitty. I am more inclined to believe it was the former, as a recent interview with Tetsuya Nomura might suggest. We'll get into that shortly. Anyone saying this YUFFIE DLC is not integral or an optional ignored all the overt references to the Wutai War in this remake compared to the original game at this point in the story. Heck, don't even get me started on the name Intergrade, which really does add insult to injury. I can hear the marketing guys sitting in their boardroom laughing right now. Intergrade sounds an awful lot like FF7 Remake Part 1.5 or a final mix. They never failed to tell us how much they deliberated over making the remake one game or several. Eventually this remake was conceived as a saga that was going to come out in parts over several years, so it's kind of disgusting that the slimy prick still managed to slip in a piecemeal paid story DLC model into the mix before the remake saga is even complete. FF7 Remake Part 1 may be a satisfying game in its own right, but it is the first in a series of games remaking a game that already exists in its entirety. Never lose sight of that. Segmenting the remake has now given Square Enix a hype period which they can exploit the audience with. Let us also not forget that Weiss and Deep Ground from the FF7 Dirge Cerberus PS2 game from the compilation of Final Fantasy 7 are in this DLC now, reimagined along with Yuffie's appearance. So just how optional is this optional DLC? Something that draws from existing Final Fantasy 7 lore and history. How much context do we lose 1 or 2 games from now if we don't keep paying into this dream between titles? Apologists are trying to already diminish the significance of this DLC, but the more Square Enix tease the audience, the less this seems to be the case. I wonder how insignificant this DLC will be when theory crafters and fucking analysis channels are dissecting it, trying to extrapolate what happens in the future across Yuffie's arc and beyond. Optional my ass. So, as I mentioned earlier, to demonstrate how it's more likely this DLC model was conceived prior or during the game's development, I also want to refer to a tweet made by Audrey, a long-time translator of Square Enix employee interviews. Ideas that Nomura floated around for FF7 Remake Part 1 prior to and during its development, like a wise boss battle, were strangely omitted and have now turned up here, siphoned off to this paid DLC. Are you starting to get a picture of this business model now? You could even now argue that the integrated iteration of FF7 Remake on PS5 is now the more complete version of FF7 Remake Part 1, a version of FF7 Remake Part 1 and Midgar's world that now incorporates Yuffie, something owners of the PS4 version are now denied behind a paywall. You might say this is all backroom dealing with Sony to make the PS5 console more enticing, along with FF16 being console exclusive, but it takes two to tango. Doesn't make this move any less shittier, fam. I'm gonna wrap up this rant here, but FF7 Remake certainly isn't the first or last offender. I just felt that it was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. A project that has so much goodwill behind it decided to just exploit the audience. Like chumps, many will keep paying into this dream to make it a reality. We had times where games were conceived as feature and content complete with no nasty surprises later on. We now not only have a project to remake an existing game that is releasing games in an episodic structure, but we can now expect more episodes between these fucking episodes. Is it wrong for me to assume this opens the floodgates for a shit ton of Vincent's development to just be siphoned off to paid DLC? We've screened Square Enix's track record. There's a precedent, certainly. It's a shame that the best thing that Japanese game development learned from the West are these exploitative games as service business models. Thank you for watching.